recording here, and you can start the recording.
Got it.
All right. So this is interview with Dan, aka the man. Take one. Dan, how old are you?
I am 39, about to turn 40.
40. Okay, cool. How many kids do you have?
I have two sons, and their names are, I hadn't thought about that. Do I want to say their names on YouTube?
We can take that out if you...
I don't know. I think I feel okay with it. I didn't ask about it.
Okay.
Anyway, I have two sons. Their names are Marcus and Eli.
Marcus and Eli. Okay, and how old are they?
8 and 5, almost 6.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And what do you do for a living?
Yeah, so right now I am working as a pastor of a small church. It's kind of like a startup. So in the church world, we call it a church plant. And so our church is about 2-3 years old, 30-ish people, mostly younger, downtown, lots of students, kids, kind of collection of people in some of the downtown neighborhoods we meet in the Glebe.
Cool.
Yeah.
And how long have you been doing that for?
Pastoring, well, I kind of came into pastoring by accident about 10 years ago. And so this is my second pastoring job, and I'm starting this church like about 2-3 years. So
2-3 years.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And you're enjoying it. So
I love it.
That's awesome.
I love it. I see myself not only as a pastor to my church, but also a pastor to my neighborhood. And I really love what I get to do. Caring for people, walking with people. And then I do a little bit of affordable housing advocacy as well. And so I love it.
Nice. We might touch on that later. So you mentioned you were married.
Yes.
How long have you been married for?
So I am married to a phenomenal woman. Her name's Melody. We got married 10 and a half years ago, and she's amazing. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. So when I was 31 years old, my life was going down this track that everything looked like it was lining up perfectly, like exactly how I wanted it. And I was extremely hopeful about the future. I just married Melody, who's phenomenal. I was in a new job that I loved, and we had really wanted to get pregnant for about 6 months, and we did. And I was so excited to be a father. And I won't forget, my wife and I were on vacation in Chicago, and I had a beard back then, and I was shaving, and right on the line where I would trim my beard near my salivary gland, there was this bump. And I remember kind of being like, okay, this isn't going away. I should probably make a doctor's appointment. But it didn't seem like a huge deal. And one of my best friends is a family doc, and he was like, it's probably nothing. Because usually it is nothing. And so I started this process of getting it checked out. And every test that I did, the doctors would send me for more tests, because it kept not being these like nothing things that they expected it to be. So then fast forward, and Mel is in labor. So this is October 2015 with our first child, Marcus, in the hospital. And one of the doctors on our family health team is literally delivering Marcus, and our doctor's office is calling with results. And it was this surreal moment of like, there's something going on with my health with this bump, and yet I'm becoming a father at the exact same time. And I won't forget, this doctor said to me, like, you need to like focus right now and not worry about your own health. Like, this is like, you're becoming a dad. Like, this is a massive moment. So then fast forward 3 months later, and it's now, I guess 4 months later, February 2016. And I heard the devastating news that it was cancer. And it honestly felt like my world was falling apart. And not only was it cancer, but I found out that it was like there were a couple options of what kinds of cancer it could be, and it was kind of the worst scenario, and it was devastating. And so I went through this process of wrestling with. I had this ideal life that I wanted, a job I loved, an amazing wife. I was a new father, and I was staring death in the face. And so when Marcus was about 6 years old, in April of 2016, I began the process of surgery and radiation.
And what type of cancer was it?
Yeah, so it's a rare cancer, and don't ask me too scientific questions because I'll say things that are probably not true, but adenoid cystic carcinoma, and it's a type of cancer, in my understanding, that usually starts in a gland, and for me it was salivary gland, and then eventually works its way into your lungs. And it's a very slow growing, rare but lethal cancer. So I won't forget when I was diagnosed, my ear, nose, throat doctor looked me in the face and said, this cancer will take a long time. It could be 20 years, but it will kill you. And so it was like getting a death sentence at 31 years old. And it was just a surreal moment. Yeah.
So how did your wife react to that?
Well, we were both devastated. My wife is Chinese Canadian, and so how we process our emotions is different, and we've been learning how to honor each other in that experience, and yeah, so I don't always, I'm still learning how to totally see what's going on in her experience. She's also very introverted, but it was obviously devastating. And for both of us, our biggest grief, I think, was around the fact that we were new parents. A few times in our marriage, Melody said to me, I know that I will be okay because I know a few things. I know God loves me, which is huge. I know I have friends and family around me who are amazing. And she really does. Like, she has phenomenal women in her life who will go to bat for her. But she said, I'm worried about our kids and whether they'll be okay because they're so young. And that's real. Like, I also know Melody will be okay. She has phenomenal women around her, but it takes a lot more trust to believe that the kids will be okay. And that God is big enough to care for them and provide for them when so much of their life is still unknown. Like, their story is in the first few chapters still. And so where their lives are going and what the end of their story will look like is way less clear. While like my wife, her values are so deep, I know where she's going and that she'll be okay.
So because of that, did you feel comfortable opening up to her when this was happening?
Yeah, so in about July 2016, I'd had the surgery. It did not go as planned. The cancer had spread a bit in my neck. So like if you picture, I found this analogy really helpful. My doctor said, picture an egg carton. You open an egg carton, and what do you hope is that you pick up an intact egg. And an intact egg is easy to remove from an egg carton. He's like, picture this scene being like opening an egg carton and the egg has splattered. And so my surgeon essentially had to successfully try to remove all the cancer. That was not this like neat, intact thing like he hoped. It had started to spread up one of the nerves, and I don't know all the details I was under, but I found that analogy really helpful, even if it's not really that accurate. in terms of what his experience was like. So this surgery was way longer than it was supposed to be. The recovery was way longer than it was supposed to be. When I was healing, I had this devastating experience where they're like encouraging you to try to like take liquids, because at first I couldn't eat because it was neck surgery. So once I was allowed to start taking liquids, they weren't like fully going down my throat, but they were also coming out my wound, which is bad. And so you like, the medical team are trying to help you and encourage you of like, oh, we really want these liquids to go down only your throat and not go into your wound. And you're like laying there and you're like, well, I can't help that process. Like I can't will my wound to heal. Like I can't just like make it happen. So it was devastating because you're completely powerless. And so I needed an NG tube and I ate out of a tube. That's how I was discharged. There's this picture of me and my 6-month-old son, and he's sitting on my lap and I'm reading a story with this tube coming out of my nose. It was so hard and not what I signed up for. And then after that, I went through radiation and 35 treatments of radiation. You know, like everyone has their own story. But for me, it felt like my life and my vitality was being sucked out of me. It was way harder than I expected. And I remember one day looking at the wall, sitting on the couch in my living room, and just unable to like get up. And a couple of my housemates who were also people of faith, they were like, well, I think we just need to like praise our way through this, right? Like just sing and spend time like reflecting on how good God is and how powerful he is. And it was one of the first times in my life where I was like, I don't think that's gonna work. Like, this isn't just like this problem that you just like crank the music and you can just like praise your way through. There's something bigger going on here that is just completely like I'm stuck. It was really hard. And finally I got to this point where I couldn't even do it in my house. I had to leave because I was so ashamed. But pick up a phone and call a Christian counselor and be like, I'm not okay. And I had 2 sessions and she was like, your wife needs to be here. Like we're not doing this journey without your wife. So it's a long way to answer your question, but yeah, I finally was able to be open with Mel about how I was doing, how hard it was. She was able to share how hard it was for her. We were able to explore ways that we were both coping in unhealthy ways. Escapism that was leading to destruction, both our lives, but also potentially for our marriage. And it was hard. We were in counseling for a couple of years, but I'm so grateful. And my Christian counselor used this counseling technique that I didn't really expect, but was super helpful, where we would talk and she would listen, but it was way more about getting us to talk to each other and getting us to pray and talk to God and actually hear from God than about like hearing from her. And so it was quite foundational for both of our lives and quite healing.
So it sounds like communication was one of the key parts of kind of coming to this understanding of this challenge that you were both going through in your own spaces, right? So what practical things were you able to do to kind of reconcile those challenges together?
Yeah. Definitely, our counselor facilitated some of that. So she gave us some really helpful questions and homework. The discipline of...
what type of homework?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What type of homework?
Well, my therapist is quite thorough. So she has like a whole curriculum that she actually takes people through. And so the curriculum actually explored not only the areas of our lives of why we were seeing her, but she kind of did a deep dive into our childhood and just into like many parts of our lives. And so it actually began with like, on our own, we had to watch like videos and do questionnaires. And before she even really dove into stuff with us, she kind of got this holistic picture of our lives. We had to do timelines. So, my wife and I had done a really good job before we got married in premarital counseling, kind of sharing our stories with each other, but we did even deeper dive with our counselor, and she was just really big on like full disclosure, like what are all your habits, hang-ups, areas of shame, guilt, like just put them all on the table. And so she kind of facilitated that process for us in this really good and helpful way. And then we slowly like work through all of that and trying to get at like what is the pain that is actually motivating this behavior rather than just like trying to stop doing something, like get at the core, the root. So our counselor facilitated a lot of that. We also just started to chat, and somewhere along the way we got into a discipline of praying together and really trying to support each other.
And what benefits did you see from that?
With my life?
Yeah.
Huge benefits. It's funny to say because I only know my story, and I don't know, like everyone has their own story, their unique story, their own unique experience, but I'm grateful for cancer, which is like a weird thing to say. It was the hardest thing that I've ever gone through in my entire life. But my relationship with Melody is so rich and so deep because this horrific event, instead of like running away from it or trying to escape from it or trying to numb the pain, we went like deep dive in together and went to that dark place together. And now we're so much stronger and healthier, I believe, for it. And then also because we were honest and real with each other, now we know how to fight for each other. We know like where the other one is kind of tempted to doubt themselves or doubt God or believe lies or try to numb pain in unhelpful ways. And all of that, I think, has just given us so much more compassion and love for each other, but also like tenacity to help the other person. And so, yeah, like our marriage is so rich, and you never know what your story would be if you were on a different timeline or a different storyline. I only know my story, but I really believe that horrible experience that we went through together has really made us stronger.
And how did that impact your kids?
Yeah. I think that I am a better father, that my kids will be the judge when they get older because of this experience of going through cancer. I'll never forget, I did this workshop called Coping with Cancer, and one of the activities was to write down like your priorities and kind of like almost like a bucket list. And it became really clear to me that my kids were close to the top of that priority list. It was like my relationship with God as a person who follows Jesus, my relationship with my wife, and then my kids, like a close third. And it's like, how do I, my mid-30s by that point, maybe I was still only like 32, 33, orient my life where my kids know, like, you are so important. That they know they're loved, that they're treasured, and that also their parents, that we have this strong relationship, this strong foundation with God and with one another that creates a safe haven in our household. Jesus has kind of given me this picture of like, what does it look like to even if the world is crazy, which so often it does feel crazy, like the entire world around you can feel like chaos, to actually experience peace within that chaos. And Jesus is that peace in my experience. And scripture says that he is that peace. And I'm so thankful that I'm starting to actually experience that. So what does it look like to be okay, even if everything around you is not okay? And what does it look like to then be that kind of person for your kids, where their world may not be okay, but they still feel like there's safety and security because you're okay?
Did your kids know about the diagnosis?
Yeah,
How did
it's
that?
a great question.
Yeah, how did that go?
I've been given advice by a couple people that maybe we should not have told our kids about my journey, but I don't know how you don't talk about it. Every 3 to 6 months, I have a CT scan, and during COVID, don't know the exact time, but it was winter, probably about 3 years ago, I found out that the cancer had returned to my lungs, and I'd already had 2 surgeries to remove cancer in my lungs, but at this time it was in too many spots to do surgery. And I was devastated. Like, I was taken out for a weekend, like emotional tears. And it's like, I don't know how you just ignore that completely. Like, hey kids, there's nothing going on. I'm just a mess. Like, I can't do that. And then also, I just really felt like our kids could have this invitation to pray and be involved in this process of, like, I constantly struggle with what does it look like to have faith that God could potentially heal, and that he's actually powerful enough to heal, but also that he's in control, and whatever the outcome is, that doesn't change whether or not he's good. Like my life ending up the way I think it should, like, I'm not the judge of what is best in the world. And so how do I see myself rightly in this, in this, in the world? And so my kids know, they pray, they're young enough, like 8 and 6. My 8-year-old's just starting to wrestle with what's starting to happen. But I'm glad it's not hidden from them.
How did you talk about that with them?
Yeah. It's challenging. One of the challenges is right now, cancer is growing in my lungs, but I am still healthy. And so I am like all the other dads of my kids' friends, and maybe even healthier than some of the other dads, because I still exercise 6 days a week, and I'm still trying to do whatever I can to be healthy. And so I'm driving my kids to hockey, we're running, we're playing sports in the backyard, we're doing all of these things like they're friends, but we're living with the reality that at some point, and maybe some point soon, I'll start to get symptoms of this cancer that's growing in my lungs. So it even to me, but I suspect that you never fully know what your kids are thinking or experiencing. It's still this like weird reality of they know, but you don't fully know because there's no evidence of it besides a doctor saying from a CT scan that something's growing. So I think it'll be different once I start to have like symptoms and can't do things. But fortunately right now I can do things. So I see it play out mostly, and it's actually quite heartbreaking for me when we talk about the future. And there's a couple of times my oldest, like, just straight faced, will be talking about, like, when you're in your 20s or something, and he's like, Dad, you'll be dead. And it's like heartbreaking. And you realize, like, this is knowledge for you intellectually, but I don't think this is knowledge for you, like, at a heart level yet. Where, like, I'm not sure you would just say that so matter-of-factly. And so they're still processing. We've thought about, counseling and stuff for them, but it doesn't seem appropriate. And so we don't want to force them to have an emotional response if they haven't yet.
I mean, what was their reaction when you told them the first time?
Oh, well, yeah. So my oldest son, his whole life, I've had cancer. And my youngest son, when he was 3 months old, the cancer came back. And so both of my kids, when my wife was on mat leave, I was on sick leave. Like, it was horrible. We were like, okay, well, now we're done having children. So both of their lives and experience has always been me battling cancer. So there's never been like a experience of finding out. It's just what is. I can't imagine, like, if I were to receive the diagnosis today and disclosing that to my 8-year-old and what that would be like. But my kids, it's just always been, the sky is blue and dad has cancer. They're just facts. It's weird.
Do you feel like that's jaded their perception of life?
It's a good question. Before bed, we pray one of the Psalms. And it's Psalm 91, and one of the lines is praying that sickness will not come near your home. And one of my kids asked his godmother a few weeks ago, and she put it in the bed, maybe a few months ago now. Like, is that true? Like, if we pray, like, God protect our home from sickness, like, why does my dad have cancer? And I think actually that's one of the questions that my kids are going to have to wrestle with as they get older, is could a good and loving God, like, still, how can people get sick, right, if there's a good and loving God? So right now they're processing that as 8 and 6-year-olds, which is like deep and profound and also not. Like, they don't have the language yet to have those deep conversations, but they're asking questions. And we'll just do our best to try to answer some of life's hardest questions as it goes. But I'm thankful it's a conversation. I realized, talking to a friend, like, my kids are growing up where it's actually safe to ask these hard questions and it's just part of life, while lots of other kids, especially kids potentially raised in faith homes, like, those questions are not even like asked or allowed to be asked. Like, how could you question a song, right? Like, it's sacred, it's whatever. Like, don't have unbelief. Well, in our household, it's like, yeah, that's a real question. And then there's like space to talk and to process and to ask God to reveal himself together. But like, I highly doubt we're doing it perfectly. We're kind of stumbling along in the dark. But God has been like super faithful to us in the process.
Those parents that you mentioned that may not have the space or have like created the space maybe to have those conversations.
Yeah.
But maybe those conversations are necessary at some point. I don't know.
That's a great question.
Yeah, like, how would you advise them to open that door?
Yeah, so I don't think as parents you want to expose your kids to the evils of the world before you have to. But I do think if there's opportunities to be honest about what's happening, to also talk about it, like, my kids hear about wars in Ukraine at school. We don't sweep that under the rug. Like, we talk about it and then we make sure to pray about it, like, a lot. So that they know, like, yeah, this is important. But we don't get into like all the details of war and how gruesome and horrible it is. Because I think it's enough to just know that people are fighting, and that in itself is horrifying. And so I think it takes a lot of wisdom and discretion. But if something happens in your world, and your kids start asking questions, don't just like sweep it away, but actually take it as an opportunity. Yeah, and some of the questions are happening way earlier than I expected. Like, my son in JK had a kid in his class transition genders. And I had just thought before they went into school, like, this would be a grade 3, a grade 4, a grade 5 conversation. And I was like, wow, we're having this conversation at 5. Like, it's just, you just don't fully know as parents. And so that's not a conversation that I initiated, but I was like, okay, we have to have this conversation now. It's happening, it's real. And I don't know, like, don't just, if a kid asks questions, don't just sweep it under the rug.
What does that conversation look like?
That particular conversation? It's a whole new topic.
I mean, the conversation, maybe like if something happened to, let's say like a mother gets sick.
Yeah.
And they have to break the news to their kids. Like, what does that conversation look like?
Yeah. That's such a good question. This is an odd answer to your question, but the thing that comes to mind is a story. So a few months ago, I was just struggling with something, and there's this image in my living room. And one night we were having a prayer meeting, and my son, I was decorating the room to have people over, like getting candles and stuff. And my son decided that he wanted to help decorate this room. And he brought me this picture that had been given by one of our neighbors. And it's this old, very simple picture of Jesus embracing this little kid. And he gave it to me. So we hung it on the wall, not really thinking about it. Midway through that prayer meeting, that picture, I realized that God was giving me this invitation to come and sit on his lap as his child, just like my son comes and sits on my lap. It was so profound to get this picture from my son. And I just realized that there's so many things in life that I don't fully know, I don't fully understand, and that I'm actually not doing perfectly. But the invitation is to climb on my father's lap and allow him to be my dad. And so a question like, how do you disclose a chronic illness or I have 6 months to live or something to a child? I have no idea. But I know that there's like this loving father who loves us so deeply that we can crawl in his lap and just say, I have no idea how to have this conversation. And I really believe that he loves us and he strengthens us and gives us the words to say. And in one context, it may be you don't tell your kids a lot. In another context, it may be that you tell them a lot. But I don't know that we have to know how to do that on our own. I think there's something really beautiful, especially when we're facing death head on, to actually admit that we don't know, that we're just creatures, we're just dust, we're just trying to figure it out as we go along. And there's something beautiful about acknowledging that you're powerless.
What was the hardest part about this whole thing?
My whole journey.
Yeah.
I alluded to this earlier, but in my cancer journey, I've realized that if my beliefs are true, and there is a God who loves me, who is bigger than death, who's bigger than all the chaos and the evil in this world, and if it is true that he is preparing a place for me, I have nothing to be afraid of. Because this world is just a breath, it's just a comma. And for those that have hope in Jesus, like we have hope everlasting. And communion with God is the best thing we could ever experience. And so there's nothing to fear. Now I say that, But like, what's real is that I'd much rather die in my sleep than suffer. And I'm still working that through with God. So I still have fears. But when people ask me what I'm most afraid of, it really is my kids and their future. And the reason is I think that I'm becoming more and more convinced that being a parent is this really holy role that you're given that matters. Like, it really matters. And it's crazy. We give so much time and energy to like our work, which is kind of temporal. And sometimes you spend hours working on something that never even sees like other human eyes or makes a difference or whatever. And yet you stressed about it and you poured so much into it. And then you have these little and eventually big people in front of you who are begging for your attention. And you're like, can you just go watch Netflix and leave me alone? And there's just something so important about this thing that you've been given, which is also like the hardest job that you'll ever do and reveals all of your failures and faults and selfishness. And so I often wrestle with, will my kids be messed up? Like, how much money do I have to save for their therapy if I die? And there's this giant hole in their hearts because they don't have a dad. And I've walked with friends who didn't have a dad, never knew their father, and walked with them through the pain of that. And the thing I always have to come back to in the face of my fear is, do I really believe that I am not their ultimate father? So if the Bible is true and God is our Father, He is fathering all of us. And He is like ultimately the one that I, as an earthly, extremely imperfect, making it up, screwing it up dad, if He's ultimately the Father, I have to trust that I can trust Him with my kids. And if He's ultimately in control of the world and good, if my story gets cut short, redemption is still possible for my kids. And though their story may have a lot of pain, all of our stories have pain. Like, nobody gets through this life without pain. But God must be big enough to be able to redeem that and help that be beautiful. And I think what gives me hope is that one of my best friends is now a doctor who cares for people as they're dying, a palliative care doctor. And part of his story is that he got into that work because his mom died when he was a university student. And that experience of walking with her into death and trying to help her die well was so impactful for him that now he goes every day and cares for people in their last moments of their lives. And I have to trust that if God was able to redeem something so painful in his life, in his early 20s, that even if it's super painful in my kids' lives, at whatever time that happens to be, that God's big enough that He can still make it beautiful. Trust is hard.
Pain is hard. And as kids go through pain as your kids are experiencing a little bit now. But kids also get diagnosed young as well.
Yeah.
How would you advise like a teenage boy
Oh, yeah.
that's just got diagnosed with cancer?
It's really brave to be able to say, I can't do this. People use different imagery to describe their cancer journeys. Some people like the imagery of a battle that you're fighting. Some people like the imagery of a journey. I think I'm embracing the imagery of being a helpless child who just needs an embrace. So as a young person who's being diagnosed, if it feels like your world is crashing apart, know that you're not alone. Know that it is hard. It's not just like how do I somehow get strong enough to face it through this on my own. Like I have a lot of friends in AA, and I find their language about like needing a higher power and being powerless so helpful in my cancer journey, because my cancer is not something I can just wrap my hands around. And, it's not just like more effort needed to be able to get through this. Instead, it's something bigger than me, that I need something that's bigger than it to help me. And for me, that thing that's bigger has been Jesus. And so far, when I've done like the trust fall and just fallen into his arms, he hasn't let me crash to the ground. Like he's caught me, and I've been learning how to be okay. So for a young person being diagnosed, I think, oh, it's so difficult. But know that you don't have to go through this alone. Practically, like I have a lot of friends who help me. Like I have a spouse, a younger person may not have a spouse to help them, but like just getting people around you who can walk with you through this journey. Don't go through it alone. And don't settle for easy answers.
How do you open up?
Yeah. There's this image in scripture of darkness needing to come into the light. One of the things I think that's true is that like shame has this really strong grip on us. And often we're so worried that we'll be rejected if people actually knew what's true about us or what's true about what we've done. And sometimes you have horrible experiences where people end up being horrible. But sometimes, and I even wonder if often, when we actually are honest and fully let people into the dark places and actually let the light in, it ends up being so healing. And so it takes a lot of courage to be honest. And there's these instructions that link to the biblical character of Joshua that, 3 times at the beginning of the book, it says, be strong and courageous. And, I feel like that almost needs to be like in front of me every day on my mirror, because it is hard to be honest, but it's also so freeing. Like I think in the places where we feel chained and we feel trapped, when we're actually able to be honest, there's all of a sudden freedom. And the things that felt so big can actually get shrunk into more like manageable, smaller, when we actually start to let people in. Not to say that our problems end up being small, but there's like a releasing of the grip that it has on us. But we need to figure out safe places and appropriate places to start that honest journey. Sometimes you try to be honest with someone and they don't love you well. They like shut you down, or they minimize you, or they actually increase your feeling of shame. And so there is wisdom needed. And we kind of learn by, unfortunately, like trying it out. But don't just like be thoughtful about who, how, and why you're inviting people into those deep places of your lives.
How do you cope when you don't get the reaction you want?
think, again, it comes from where we're drawing strength from. So if you are looking to other people to be your anchor, to be your strength, to be your source of acceptance and affirmation, often people will disappoint you. So I do think that there's a journey where we have to find our acceptance and our affirmation, our sense of who we are, our sense of our identity in God. And like for me, one of my verses that came out in my therapy journey, when Jesus is baptized, there's these words from heaven that says, you are my beloved son with whom I am well pleased. And as someone in my own story who was desperate for affirmation and acceptance and searching for it in all the wrong places, I've been trying to learn what does that look like to receive those words from my Heavenly Father instead of from the world around me. And so if someone doesn't respond to me in the way that I need them to, in order for me to feel loved when I'm being vulnerable, I need to go back to the reminder that I am loved first and primarily by my Heavenly Father. But the flip side is also true. Like if you're super honest and vulnerable and someone has like a phenomenal reaction, like, dude, that's like the most amazing thing that impacted me so much. You also need to be grounded in who you are in God so that that reaction doesn't flare you up and build this false sense of self where all of a sudden, like you're being fed by the person's positive response. Because then you get hungry for like, how do I keep getting that, right? And so in both the negative and the super positive, you actually first need to be grounded. I think, as you're being honest with people. Obviously, we don't unfortunately have it all figured out. So we're all kind of in process, but as you're inviting people into your life, don't forget that at the end of the day, people are amazing, but they also disappoint us, and we need to be grounded in something bigger.
Would you offer the same advice of this level of like openness with somebody with kids? Would your advice kind of differ from talking to a teenage boy versus talking to a man in like their 40s, 50s?
In relationships, an image that comes to mind is a hammock. And so in relationships with people, I often think about how much trust do we have? Like, so as we're building trust, we're like weaving that hammock together so that then like if difficulty comes or we need to have a hard conversation, can the hammock like hold that? And so I think if I were talking to a young person or an older person, some of it would be similar in terms of like how much trust do we have? I definitely think for parents when they're disclosing to their children, like you're not gonna like I have not chatted with my children to the extent of how hard it was for me, because that's not their role to hold that. Like I chat with my therapist and my wife and close friends. My kids, like my role with my kids, what they need from me is for me to be their dad, for me to provide for them and protect them and nurture them and teach them and play football with them and drive them to hockey. They're not like my listening ear. And so even when I'm letting them in on like, dad has cancer and this is hard, it's not from like and then I need something from you in response, because it's not theirs to hold. But in relationships, yeah, the teenager and the dad in their 30s may need like similar in terms of like people that have that strong trust having with them, that can walk with them in that. Yeah, I don't know if that's a helpful response, but
It was.
yeah.
It was. The experience of first being diagnosed can be a very different experience from getting another diagnosis.
Yeah. So like one of the things that's been really hard in my cancer story, I joined a support group through like a agency here in Ottawa, and I never felt really like I fit in. So there were only two of us who were younger. I was the only male. Most of them it was breast cancer. One of them it was ovarian cancer. Like I clearly am not like these other people. And as we've journeyed together, they've been amazing. But I'm currently, as far as I know, the only one who their cancer has come back. And so like you get together for dinner and, you know, someone will say, let's toast to, this happened the last time we hung out, let's toast to not having cancer. And one of the women is like, stop it, no, you can't, like, that's so, and I'm like, yeah, it's so hard. We kind of long for that narrative of, you know, you get diagnosed and you go through the treatment and then you're fine. And I found that people don't know what to do with the narrative that I find myself in, which is I got diagnosed with cancer. I went through some really hard treatments and it came back like 3 years later. And currently my story is that there are no proven treatments for my cancer. So I did an experimental trial a year or two ago. I took these immunotherapy pills. I was super hopeful about it. And then I spent my son's fourth or fifth birthday on the toilet, both ends, the whole weekend. And I was like, I can't do this. Like I feel like if I were 80, I would totally be willing to do an experimental trial where maybe I would get sick. But like, I feel amazing right now, even though there's cancer in my lungs. And I literally have a 4-year-old eating cake downstairs who needs me. And the only thing I have energy for is laying on my bed watching sports. And I cannot exist like this, even if it's gonna prolong my death. Like, this is not life. And so after a horrible weekend of needing to decide, and a ton of pressure from the doctor who was, I think, trying to do what he believed was best for me. In some Christian traditions, there's this day called Ash Wednesday that kicks off the season of Lent. And it's a day where you reflect on the fact that there's sin in the world and that things are not right and things are broken. And because of our rebellion against God and doing things our own way, death has entered into all of our stories. And you can put like ashes on your forehead in the form of a cross to remind you that from dust we come and to dust we will turn, and the consequence of a rebellion. And I was literally with a small group of people from my church in a church basement, studying scripture and praying. And at the end of the night, I was putting these ash crosses on people's foreheads while knowing I had to make a decision in the next 24 hours about whether or not I'd still do this trial. And I could not escape the reality that death is a part of all of our stories. And in my story, it's so much earlier than I would like. And so it's a really hard journey. It's a really hard experience. And I find trying to talk about it with other people is difficult because a lot of well-meaning people either say like, well, you should do more, right? Like there's got to be some kind of trial out there, some kind of drug, some kind of treatment. And so you can feel like, well, I'm just not doing enough. Like I'm just not finding enough. Or like, I need to tweak my diet, or I need to take more pills, or I need to like do something. Or in Christian circles, like I just don't have enough faith. Like it's my fault that I still have cancer because I just don't believe. And so I've had to sit in that reality of like, what do I feel like my invitation from God is? And what's mine? And so far, um, I feel like I'm growing in faith, and yet I'm not healed and have to live in that story. I think I could have way more faith, like I have not nailed it. But I also don't think it's about my effort. Like I don't think I haven't done. God actually spoke to me in prayer at the one time, which I know is weird to say, but I'm growing in a relationship with God where I feel like I can discern His voice. And I really felt like He said to me once, like, um, "This is not your fault," which I really needed to hear, because sometimes well-meaning people, in terms of how they try to care for you, they're trying to care for you in terms of saying like, well, have you tried this? But as the person in the suffering, it can feel like it's your fault because you haven't tried this. And I just really needed to receive that invitation of it is not my fault. And I don't have to take every piece of advice from every single well-meaning person. And I'm still in the middle of my story. God could miraculously heal me tomorrow. I could feel convicted to cut something from my diet. I don't know. But right now in my story, I'm in the tension of needing to come to terms with this is not my fault.
Do you have any final words of advice, or no, not final words of advice? Let me redirect
so
that.
Wise.
Yeah. Do you have any final words of encouragement for people struggling with a diagnosis like this?
I keep giving you stories. When I was diagnosed and my world fell apart, I didn't know how to frame and put to words what I was experiencing. And so as a person of faith, my wife and I were like, well, we need people to pray. So we had this little prayer meeting downtown in this building. We all like took some time to stop and be silent and listen and give some silence before people shared and prayed. And there was a woman there who came up to us and she said, I get this image that you guys are in the middle of this story of the disciples in the boat, and a great storm comes up and they're literally afraid they're going to die. And they turn to Jesus and they say, don't you care about us? That was so helpful. And I had 2 or 3 other people who were not at that meeting get the same story. Like those texts and messages of like, hey, I was praying for you. I got this scripture. I don't know if it means anything. I realized deep down that was one of my biggest spiritual questions is, God, don't you care about me? Like, this is so hard. It's so crazy. I feel like I'm going to get flipped over by the waves, and I feel so alone. And not only do I feel alone, but you're sleeping in the boat and you're supposed to be in charge. That story was really helpful for feeling like it gave me permission to say that and to experience that, like to put words to my feelings. The story ends where Jesus wakes up and he calms the winds and the waves. And the disciples realize, like, dude, I didn't even know he could do that. So like they're trying to wake up Jesus because they'd help like steering or like bailing the water of the boat. But he gets up and shows them that actually he's way more capable of doing things than they thought that he was. And that's been my story of living with cancer with 8 years, is that God in my story, through his faithfulness and his love, has used this as a catalyst to expand my soul and enlarge my soul, to actually teach me about how deep his love is and how powerful he is. And so my advice for someone receiving a diagnosis, especially if you're a person of faith, but even if you're not, is don't be afraid to scream your questions to God. And I truly believe it does take some work. It takes like staying in the game and not quitting and like hanging on to your faith even when it doesn't make sense. But I really do believe that God is with you in the boat, and he's so much bigger than you could even imagine. And I don't think all of our stories means that we get healed, because unfortunately we don't all make it out of this life alive. None of us do. I think some of you could be healed because God's that big from cancer. But for some of you, you may encounter God in this profound, life-changing way in the midst of cancer, where you realize he's so much bigger and greater and more loving than you thought he was. So it's okay if you're at the point of the story where you're like in the middle of the night and the waves are super high and the wind is super strong and it feels like he's sleeping. But keep going, because your story's not over yet.
Thanks, Dan.
Hi, thank you for watching that video. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, subscribe, and click on that little bell notification to get notified on the latest drops. Also, let us know what you thought of the video in the comments below. Your feedback's important to us. And if you found this valuable at all, be sure to share. The purpose of this channel is to help us build as individuals and as a community, and you sharing this content helps us do that. Lastly, if you want to support what we do, you can sign up for our Patreon. There you can find full-length interviews, the ability to give your input on latest topics for the channel, and much more. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you next time. Peace.